So we're going to get started here in a second, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for our first visit with Victor. I'm really excited to have all of you here today. I'm so proud to be joined with Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver, my dear friend. And so we'll get started here in just a second. We were talking about everything from ring lights to cats to
coyotes.
To what was going on, to the beautiful weather that we had today. So we're really just covering the gamut as we get ready to talk about voting rights, House Resolution 1 in Congress, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And so really grateful for everybody for tuning in. We're going to give it just another second for folks to continue to log on. I see Mark Fidel is joining us. Hey, Mark, how are you doing? Good to see you.
Hi, Mark.
So I'm going to go ahead and get us started while people join in. Again, everybody, welcome to the first Visits with Victor. My name is Victor Reyes. I'm so excited to be able to be here with each and every one of you as we discuss voting rights, House Resolution 1, other measures that are happening at the state level and at the federal level to make sure that we are protecting the right to vote for every single New Mexican. I'm joined here today with Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver for this first Visits with Victor. I'm so excited to have her here today. Welcome, Maggie.
Thanks for having me. I didn't know this was the first one. So
this is the first one.
Awesome.
And I think it was important for me for it to be the first one because, as you know, who we elect, the ability for us to have a voice in the elections process is so critical for everything it is that we do. Whether we're talking about reproductive justice or environmental justice, or we're talking about fighting for a $15 an hour minimum wage, the ability for us to elect members of our community who reflect those values is so critical. And, you know, I was thinking about it, Maggie, about how we met and how we first started working together. And I'll never forget when I was the political and legislative director for Conservation Voters New Mexico, you were still the Bernalillo County clerk at the time, and we were working on elections bills. And I remember, you know, the groups that were in the legislature that were engaged in elections issues were all kind of wondering, well, why is Conservation Voters New Mexico so hyper engaged on voting bills and on elections bills? And it was just very important for me and for the organization because when we talked about protecting our air, land, and water, it was clear that we needed to be able to have the ability to elect pro-environment candidates that were going to reflect those issues and reflect those values. And I was so amazed, Secretary, of how hard you fought for that rights, how hard you fought to make sure that we had a fair and equitable election system back when you were the county clerk. And now, you know, as Secretary of State, I'm amazed. And so I'm just so honored to have you here today.
Well, that is very sweet of you to say, and thank you. And thank you for all the work you've done. And for me, this is kind of just a twofold opportunity because number one, you are one of my best friends, and given my crazy schedule, and now that you're running for Congress, we rarely get to talk these days. So we're getting to talk. And also, as you know, any chance that I can get to talk about voting and elections and voting rights, I will gladly take it. So thanks for giving me a little forum for that.
You're awesome. So, you know, one of the first bills that I'm excited to co-sponsor in Congress because of how important that intersection and that right is House Resolution 1, the For the People Act, making sure that people have a voice in the election system, making sure that people have access to our vote, to the ballot box, making sure that we're able to get money out of politics. I've made it clear that I'm not taking a dime of corporate PAC money, and that's really important to me because I think that when people look at their elected leaders and they think about why is it so hard sometimes to get the policies and the bills and the legislation across that we think is so critical, whether we're talking about healthcare and lowering prescription drug costs, or we're talking about housing and making sure that people have equitable housing. What people have noticed is that corporations all too often have an undue influence in our process and have more of a voice than, you know, my neighbors across the street have, or anybody else that's engaged. And so I'm really proud to say that that'll be one of the first bills that I co-sponsor in Congress, right along with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And, you know, I wanted to get your take on the For the People Act. I know that it's something, you know, no elections issues. You're a national leader when it comes to these issues. And so wanted to get your take on it.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. So I think HR 1 is a very important bill, and it's important for a lot of reasons. It does sort of 5 primary things. First of all, it calls for modernizing voter registration across the country. As most people on this call know, and if people didn't know before 2020, they really know now, each state, you know, basically makes its own rules when it comes to elections. And so what you have is you have some inconsistencies. You have voter voting in a presidential election in state A that has all sorts of access and opportunity to voter registration and the ballot. And then you have a voter in state B that doesn't have those same opportunities. And to me, it just makes sense for there to be a fair and equitable playing field for every voter that votes in a federal election. By the way, just a quick caveat, I have a really noisy cat. You may see a kiddo cameo here at some point. So this is, you know, this is life in the COVID age. So it modernizes voter registration. It does a lot of the things we've already done here in New Mexico in terms of automatic voter registration, online voter registration in states, and so a lot of these things that some states do and other states don't. It's going to try to level that playing field for voters. It protects the voter, the ballot, and the process. So creating a uniform national standard and boosting safeguards to make sure that eligible voters can cast their ballot. It addresses redistricting. You know, really there are 3 pillars to having a small d democratic government, you know, making sure that we have fair districts, making sure that we have access to the ballot box, and making sure the next piece of HR 1 is that campaign finance piece that you're talking about, that we have fair and equitable campaign finance laws. So campaign transparency and addressing a lot of the loopholes that have existed since Citizens United, right? And then lastly, and one of the things I like the most about it is the funding opportunities. We here in New Mexico will be eligible for grants to continue to improve our voter registration and other election systems here in New Mexico. As a poor state, we need those funds, often a lot more than some other states do. So we will be applying for those grants to try to keep building our system. So just a lot to love in HR 1.
Yeah, and you talked, Secretary, about campaign disclosure and campaign transparency. We worked together in 2019 on Senate Bill 1 to provide more transparency, more disclosure at the state level when it came to who was influencing our elections and who was engaging in the political process. How critical is that when it comes to making sure that we are truly having a democratic process that we can all be proud of and that reflects the promise, I think, that we all see when we go to the ballot box?
Well, it's incredibly critical for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the transparency piece is so important because, you know, we live in a society and we have a form of government where we assume, but not only that, we want voters to have as much information as possible when they go to the ballot box. And to be a fully informed voter, it's really helpful to know where the money's coming from in terms of who's running for office. Because if you know where the money's coming from, you have a pretty good idea about where the values of the candidate lie, what kinds of issues they care about, which side of an issue they care about. And, you know, again, referring back to Citizens United, which is, you know, that Supreme Court decision that's left us with a lot of, you know, dark money in politics. One of the most important outcomes of that decision, actually, I always refer to this, was pointed out by Justice Scalia, who said, we can't, in his opinion, we can't really, you know, have these restrictions, but the transparency piece is absolutely tantamount. We have to have that, paramount, excuse me. We have to have that for informed voting decisions. So we could talk about, you know, the other things it does and try to close some of those loopholes. But again, that transparency is the most important piece.
No, absolutely. I think that is critical to knowing who stand where a candidate stands, getting the full picture of who they listen to, who their networks are, where they're going to stand on the issue. I think that's a critical component to make sure we have. And the other aspect of HR1 that you mentioned is making sure that there's an equitable distribution when it comes to polling locations and that there's access. I talk a lot about how communities of color are so disproportionately impacted by so many of the injustices that we see, so many of the injustices, frankly, that corporations put upon our communities and that we see on a daily basis. And, in New Mexico, we have a unique responsibility, and we value the fact that every single community and their voice is important. And so I think that's another thing about HR1 that is so critical, is that component of making sure that no one is left out of the process because they can't make it to the ballot box. They feel that it's too far. In this pandemic, one of the things that you and I dealt with before the special session was Native American communities, and making sure that Native American communities had access when it came to voting in a COVID world, where we saw that our Native American communities, our sovereign nations, bore so much of the weight, whether it was the Navajo Nation or whether it was our pueblos, making sure that they were not left out of that process. How would HR1 impact these communities? How would it create those protections that I think are so critical to us as New Mexicans?
Well, what it does, and your point is, it's so well taken. I think we do a pretty good job here in New Mexico when it comes to creating equity in terms of access to the ballot box. As you said, we work really hard to ensure that we have polling places even in rural and tribal locations, right? That, may have to drive a long way otherwise. We have no fault absentee voting. So anybody can apply for an absentee ballot no matter where they live. We've started creating drop-box opportunities around the state. We started that in the last election. But again, these are not opportunities that exist everywhere. We have robust early voting here. We have 4 full weeks at the county clerk's office and 2 full weeks before, or actually it's even longer, 2.5 full weeks before Election Day. Every state doesn't have that, right? So what this bill does is it, again, creates that minimum standard. It says if you're a voter voting in a federal election, because if you're voting for Congress in state A or state B, you should have the same access. So what this bill does is really create some of those minimum standards. And again, what's great about this bill in many ways is we don't have to do very much. We wouldn't have to change very much here in New Mexico because we're already doing a really good job. And in fact, a lot of these minimum standards that HR1 would put in place, we're already blowing way past those. We're already doing way more than what this bill would call for. But because there are places that are still not doing enough, as you know, Victor, there are states that are trying to make it harder now for people to vote early, harder now for people to vote absentee. They have notarized, notary signature requirements to apply for an absentee ballot in certain states. And anybody who's had to get a document notarized in the last year knows it's almost impossible right now in a COVID environment. So again, creating that sort of consistent standard, this bill does a lot of that I think is going to do a lot of good for a lot of voters.
And Secretary, it wasn't too long here in New Mexico, we saw those assaults on our voting rights be proposed in the legislature, and we had to fight like hell. You were at the front lines of that effort. I was really proud to be able to support you in that, to make sure that those actions that would have jeopardized that right, whether it was identification requirements at the polling locations, or any number of different measures that were pushed forward by Republicans at a time when they controlled the state House of Representatives, we had to make sure that they didn't go any further. And we had to hold some of our own Democrats accountable as these bills were moving through the process. And so I think that's really important. And I think that's, speaking of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that when we saw the Voting Rights Act gutted in Shelby County versus Holder, these protections are protections that we need to have enshrined within federal statute to make sure that nobody is ever questioning whether or not they will have the right to vote. We'll never be questioning whether or not they will be able to participate in a process that they've been promised to. Hey, Max, I see you. And so I'm really, and so I'm really, so I, hey, Max, I miss you.
I can't hear you right now, Victor.
Oh no, he can't hear me.
I'll tell him later.
Yeah, tell him I miss him. So I think it's such a critical effort that we're looking at, and when it comes to it, and you know, we fought and you've been talking about automatic voter registration since before it was cool to talk about automatic voter registration. And let me tell you, as a young person of color, just how much that means to me, to make sure that, you know, we are getting as many community members, as many generational shifts as we can with the process by encouraging these types of efforts at the federal level that we can see to make sure that we are creating a pipeline to civic engagement. And so I think that that's another part of HR1 that people often don't think about, is the ways of making it easier. You know, you've helped make it easier here at the state level when it comes to same-day voter registration and making it easier for people to register to vote who might have otherwise missed a deadline or felt like they were excluded from that process. Do you think that these key components, do you think they will have that effect when it comes to engaging community colors, engaging younger voters, that I'm hopeful that we will have?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think, you know, if we think about how society has evolved, you know, these types of things, you know, this automatic voter registration, online voter registration, all these opportunities to vote early and things like that, you know, those were not societal norms, you know, even when I started voting for the first time back in 1994, you know, there was no such thing as early voting in New Mexico. You went and voted on election day, or you voted absentee because you weren't going to be in town, right? But we live in this society now, the people that are turning 18 and that are in that 18 to 25, you know, age group, that, you know, always considered the youth vote age group, they're digital natives, right? You know, they have grown up on the internet, they have grown up with technology, and we live in a society that's incredibly demanding in terms of our time, right? We are packing more into a day now than anybody in the course of history has before us. And so we're used to being able to, you know, do things on demand, not have to wait in long lines, be able to do, you know, I do literally all of my banking online. I'm sure most of the people on here do as well, right? So to kind of get down to my point here, if we're not providing these opportunities for folks to engage in the electoral process and to participate in make their voices heard with some of these modern technologies and some of these modern conveniences that we've come to count on as a society, then we are going to lose a young generation, a generation of people of color. You know, and the reality is just that, you know, our time with technology, we can do so much more, but the demands have become so much more on us. And it is always, you know, people of color, youth, you know, folks that work multiple jobs, that have families to take care of. They are the ones who can least afford to take the time to drive a long way and wait in a long line, and only to find out they don't have the right kind of ID, right? All of these different things. So I'm very hopeful that these will be changes for the positive for these underrepresented and under participatory communities.
I think that's great. And, you know, New Mexico has been recognized at the national level for some of the security efforts and initiatives that you've helped lead the charge on. What do you think the federal government can do to support states like New Mexico? How can I, as a member of Congress, make sure that you have the resources you need to secure our elections, to make sure that everything is going as smoothly as we need to, and that there is no question on people's minds that the outcome accurately reflects the will of the people?
Well, the first thing that I can tell you, and everybody who's listening tonight, again, you know, in New Mexico, we are really ahead of the curve. A lot of, again, what this proposed legislation will do will really just help us up our game even further. This last year here in New Mexico, we were ranked number 9 out of all 50 states in terms of our election performance index that MIT does their study every 2 years. But we can be number 1. And some of the provisions in this bill will help us get to number 1. There are still a few things we're not doing here yet. We're moving closer to same-day voter registration. We are moving closer to being more universal in terms of automatic voter registration. But this bill will help us get there, not the least of which because of the funding opportunities. One of the things we really need, and what I'll ask you, Victor, if we're fortunate to have you elected to Congress, is that you advocate for consistent election funding. We don't need millions of dollars every year, but a consistent level of funding, particularly for election security. Let me just touch on that really briefly. The challenge with election security is that the biggest threat is coming from foreign actors. It's coming from Russia and from Iran and from North Korea, from places like this, right? So that is a national effort. We can't just, fight it like whack-a-mole state by state. So the grant funding that could come from this bill, and then just, if we knew, and here in New Mexico, we were always going to have a couple $100,000 a year from the federal government to shore up our election security, to protect our systems, to make sure that they can't be hacked, to test them for vulnerabilities and be able to fix those vulnerabilities, that would go a tremendously long way here.
That's amazing. Secretary, we have Evelyn that's tuning in. I'm seeing her pop up in the chats, and she is a great advocate for rural communities. I'm really honored to have gotten a chance to get to know her over the past few weeks. What do you think that we can be doing for our rural communities? How can members of Congress be advocating for rural communities and for and to make sure that they have equitable access to the ballot box?
Well, I think a lot of these things we're talking about are absolutely crucial, because the reality is that our rural communities are often sparsely populated. They're often spread out. And often we're seeing the people who can least afford to take the time to travel long distances and wait in long lines living in these communities. And here in New Mexico, they're very, it's very diverse in terms of our rural communities, but we're also talking about our tribal areas. We're talking about our colonias, right? We're talking about these places that, really have people who are already socioeconomically disadvantaged, right? And whose voices are therefore even that much more important at the polls. Because without, having your voice heard adequately, you don't get adequate representation, right? To meet the needs of the community. So making sure that there's adequate access. One of our challenges, obviously sustaining vote by mail, again, HR 1 is going to do, try to fight back against some of these vote by mail restrictions we're starting to see popping up in legislatures around the country, but also making sure that there's opportunities to get those mail ballots back timely. And so investing in our postal service, right, to ensure that they have the resources they need to meet the needs of our rural communities. Again, every voter, every citizen should have more or less equal access to the ballot and to resources. So those are just a couple things. Last, actually, before I forget, we have got to get rid of the digital divide. Our communities need broadband access, and that is probably the number one issue that affects our rural communities economically, educationally, and it's just a huge problem. And the more we can close that digital divide, the better services we can provide in general to our rural communities.
That's no question. We need to be expanding broadband access. Working during the pandemic, that digital divide has never been more pronounced. And that when it comes to voting and when it comes to making that accessible, especially when we're talking about different generations, including our elders, making sure that they have the access that they need, especially when it comes to our sovereign nations, is paramount. And that's something that I think the federal government, frankly, has not done enough, and hasn't done enough when it comes to the proposals that we've been seeing come out of Congress when it comes to COVID-19 relief. And so I think that's something that we all need to be making sure that our federal government is delivering on. to make sure that we are closing that digital divide. You know, Maggie, I was thinking, Secretary, that it wasn't too long ago that we saw the efforts to disenfranchise voters in Otero County, you know, in a community that does see a disproportionate weight of environmental injustices, does deal with economic injustices every single day. And when it came to individuals accessing the ballot box, the lines that we saw years ago were so large that it was discouraging people from participating. People didn't feel like their voice was going to be heard in that process. And so protecting that right means making sure that we are fighting against these efforts to disenfranchise voters at every single step. And, you know, and and again, grateful for your efforts then, so grateful for your efforts now and every day as Secretary of State. I've been so honored to have you on the call today. Is there anything else that you think that I should be talking about, that our listeners should be knowing about what the fights are that we need to take to Washington, D.C.?
I think I'll just end on this note. And again, thanks for having me, Victor. I'm really proud of you putting your name in the hat and running. As you know, you've been a friend of mine through many campaigns, and you know, you've seen what I've gone through, and so I have a lot of respect for you and everybody that is, you know, being brave enough to throw your hat in this ring. I know how hard this work is, and you are a dear friend, and so it's been a pleasure to be with you and talk to listeners tonight. I will just say this. You know, the 2020 election really brought a lot of critical issues to the forefront. And I think, you know, I'll sort of start with the bad news and end with the good news. The bad news is that we are heading into a critical period where states are going to be starting to work real hard to restrict voting rights. And that is a direct outcome of people being unhappy with the outcome of the presidential election and the fact that we had unprecedented election turnout in 2020 here in this country. And so, you know, they view access to the ballot box and voter participation through a purely political lens. And that's a problem. It should be a completely nonpartisan position that we all want as many people to vote as possible, right? And so making sure that we are taking the institutional steps necessary to provide that access is absolutely critical. So we're entering into this danger period where a lot of this work is going to start happening, and it's not great. And we're also dealing with the effects of mis and disinformation from the 2020 election. So we have a lot of work to do on that front to try to make sure folks are educated about how our voting systems actually work, not the conspiracy theories and you know, other stories that have been spread out there that are just simply not true. But the good news is we have a lot of amazing people working on this issue. If HR 1 passes and it gets passed through the Senate, that will be a tremendous way to fight back against some of these restrictions, in addition to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is going to put those protections back in place for our communities that need it the most. So we have work to do, and we have a fight to take on. But the good news is we have the numbers right now, we have the leadership in place right now, and we just need to continue that work because, you know, the reality is this is a marathon without a finish line. We're always going to have to beat back these attempts at injustice. But the good news is that we're in a really good spot to try to combat some of that right now. And so thank you for having me again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for fighting for us every single chance you get. You're amazing. You're a rock star. Thank you for everything.
Yeah, it's been great to be here. Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a wonderful night.
And so I'm going to end on this note. You know, I think voting rights, the ability to elect leaders that represent us, is critical for every single fight that we are going to wage. You know, it's ridiculous to think that a candidate can be solely funded by corporations and then go to Congress and vote on the same issues that those corporations are asking them to take positions on. You can have a representative in Congress that is solely bought and paid for and focused on the issues that corporations, that special interests, that dark money has and has put in front of them. That's an injustice. It's wrong. It can and it must change. And it starts with passing House Resolution 1. You know, if we want to change the status quo, if we want to see change in our communities, if we want to see change in the people who we elect, then it begins with getting this corporate money out of politics. And it begins with mobilizing in a grassroots efforts. I've told you earlier, I'm committed to not taking a dime of corporate PAC money. I'm not taking money from oil and gas, special interest. So we need to make sure that we are fighting, that we're mobilizing. And I can't do that without your help. I need you to help me by volunteering. Go to victorreyes.org today and sign up to volunteer, sign up to contribute whatever you can. Is that $1? Is that $5? Is that $2.50? Every little bit helps. That's what it means to have a people-powered effort. I'm so honored to have the support of each and every single one of you. You all have been amazing through this process. You have my word that I will be a voice for this community, for the people who feel like they don't have the words or the power themselves. But I need your help to do it. So if you can volunteer, sign up to volunteer. If you can contribute a little bit, it would mean the world to me to know that you care enough to make sure that we have leadership in office that reflects this community and their values. Thanks so much for joining us for our first Visits with Victor. I hope you enjoyed hearing from our incredible Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver. This is the first but not the last conversation that we're going to be having, so continue to join us. I'll be having conversations about healthcare. I saw some healthcare questions in the chat. I would love to bring you some of you folks into that discussion. Maybe you can be part of the next Visits with Victor. Let me know if that's something that you're interested in. We're going to talk about education. We're going to talk about reproductive justice. And so I'm really excited about the conversations to come. I hope you know that I believe that effective leadership begins with listening. And that's what these Visits with Victor are all about. Thank you guys for joining us. I hope you have a great night. It means a lot to me. victorreyes.org. Like us, like our page on Facebook. Share this Facebook live stream with your friends so that they know a little bit more about my campaign. And we'll see you next time. Take care.